Hey, good morning. You made it. You are the holy ones. Good job. Hey, those of you watching online, we love you too, as you're sitting in your pajamas. You sinners. But hey, no, I'm kidding. We love you as well, and we get it. It's freezing out there. But I am glad that you are here this morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brent. I'm the lead pastor here at Edinburgh Church, and yeah, we're glad you're here, and that we can gather and worship in this place. We have been in a series. We started last week, right? This series on Mark. We're going to be studying through the Gospel of Mark. It's going to take us all the way through Easter. We do have a reading plan in place as well. So if you haven't downloaded the app, maybe consider doing that, the Edinburgh app. You can go under resources and you'll find that reading plan there. But this is something as a church we're at least going to read through together through Easter. And then we're going to preach on some of the key events that take place throughout the Gospel of Mark. Okay? And this morning we're coming to really the first event that takes place during Jesus' ministry, okay? Last week kind of served as just preparation for his ministry. This week he begins his ministry, and this is the first key event that takes place. So we're gonna start in verse 21 of Mark 1. This morning, this is what we read. Jesus and his companions, so at this point, Jesus has called at least 4 of the disciples. He's called Simon, that's also Peter. He's called Andrew, Peter's brother, and then James and John. So these men are following Jesus and checking him out at this point, all right, see what he's all about. They're following him. It says, Jesus and his companions went to the town of Capernaum. And when the Sabbath day came, he went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, for he taught with real authority, quite unlike the teachers of the religious law. So simply what's going on here is Jesus is in this synagogue, and they're already noticing there's something different about Jesus. You see, the teachers of the religious law, they like to argue and quibble about really the do's and don'ts. And for example, they might argue over something like how many miles can you travel on the Sabbath before it said that you broke the Sabbath, the commandment of keeping the Sabbath. They would argue about these kinds of things. Jesus comes in and Jesus just starts speaking to the heart. Because what Jesus is really trying to do is not just give us all the do's and don'ts and the rules and the constraints. He's trying to change us from the inside out so that we want to live according to God's ways. And we shouldn't be surprised that he has authority when he teaches. I mean, we talked about this last week. This is God in the flesh. Jesus is fully God and fully man. And so he has this authority. And by the way, he gives us his word, the word of God. This book has authority. It's why this book has authority. This is God teaching, God speaking to this people. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's authority, but he's aiming to change us through his teaching from the inside out, something quite different from the teachers of religious law. In verse 23, we read, suddenly, while he's in the synagogue, a man in the synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "Why are you interfering with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Now, this is kind of interesting. Right away, I would have us note that, this is a man in the synagogue. If you don't know, the synagogue was the church of the day. Okay? Yes, in Israel, you had the temple located in Jerusalem, but Capernaum's about 125 miles away from Jerusalem. And so people couldn't travel to the temple every week, so where did they go? They went to the synagogue. That was their church. They would hear the Old Testament taught there. They would sing songs and worship God, similar to what we do today. It was their church, and yet you have this man. This was probably a God-fearing man who's being tormented by this demon. And there's some irony here. The irony is, who is the first person in the Gospel of Mark to testify to who Jesus is? You know, you might think it was John the Baptist. Not really. Last week we talked about John the Baptist, and he did talk about one who was coming. But we know that it took John the Baptist a while before he decided that was really Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ. You might think it was the disciples. No, it took the disciples a while of following this Jesus and seeing his miracles and hearing his teaching before they came around. In the Gospel of Mark, the first person to testify to who Jesus is a demon. It's interesting. The demon recognizes that Jesus is the Holy One of God, sees who this is, and so we see what's happening in the spiritual realm. We get this glimpse of this spiritual battle. And guys, I need to remind us this morning that whether you like it or not, you were born into a spiritual battle, okay? Call it a battle against God versus Satan, a battle of good versus evil, a battle of the light versus the darkness, whatever you want to call it. You were born into this battle, whether you like it or not. This battle's probably been taking place even before Adam and Eve were created. This is a battle. And we were born into this battle. Paul puts it this way in Ephesians 6. He says, "For our struggle, it's not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and against the authorities and against the powers of this dark world and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Guys, whether we like it or not, we were born into this battle, and it affects our lives, whether we like it or not. Let me ask you this question. Where does this battle ultimately take place? You know, I've watched some of these ghost shows over the year. I don't recommend them, but I've seen some of these, these paranormal shows. I've heard people tell their own ghost stories or paranormal stories, right? In fact, we had a family friend who this house they lived in didn't happen before, it didn't happen after they moved out, but while they were in this house, every once in a while they would come downstairs and all of their cupboards, all their cabinets in their kitchen would be flung open. Sometimes they would hear doors slamming shut. They'd hear footsteps, and here's how I would respond to that. So what? Big deal. Okay, you opened up some cupboards in the kitchen. Can you put my dishes away while you're at it? I mean, big deal. You slammed a door shut. All right, congrats. Good, I needed that door shut. I didn't want the dog getting out anyways, right? We make it about this physical, like there's this Hollywood version of thinking about it. And don't get me wrong, I think these things can happen and affect us in the physical, but that's not primarily where the battle is taking place. Where is the battle primarily taking place, guys? It's taking place in your consciousness. And I want to get deep with us for just a minute here. Because if I were to ask us, if you grew up reading the Bible, and you'd probably give a Bible answer, well, this battle is taking place in the spiritual. And that's true, but if we use the language we better understand in the West so that we can see the relevancy of this, I would tell you that where this battle is taking place is in your consciousness. Have you ever stopped to think about that? You are your consciousness. That's who you are. Your consciousness is how you perceive the world. It's the filter through which you interpret the world around you, how you dress and express yourself and speak. That's an expression of your consciousness. If you really stop and think about it, your consciousness is who you are. And that can maybe be a little confusing to us because it's kind of weird then that why do we sleep? If that's who we are, why do we sleep? Because we're not conscious. We can get knocked unconscious. We can have health problems that affects our minds and affects our consciousness. So how do we make sense of that? And I'm talking about secular scientists here, okay? They are wrestling with this problem. Where does consciousness come from? Because as they study the brain more and more, what they're realizing is consciousness seems to not exist within ourselves. It doesn't come from within ourselves. Consciousness seems to exist, in a sense, outside of us. And so here's a new theory that's being postulated, okay? And I'm talking, again, about secular science saying this, that really our brains and our physical self is a receiver for our consciousness. That your brain is a receiver, okay? And that your consciousness, therefore, is limited to your physical self. It's limited to your receiver. Whether your receiver is working properly and all that, which makes sense that when we sleep, the receiver has to sleep. And so we're not aware and we're not necessarily conscious at that point. We can get knocked unconscious. Our receiver can get knocked unconscious. People get things like dementia. We need to take care of ourselves. Keep our receiver as healthy as possible. Our bodies are temples. But this will help you understand then. This makes a lot of sense because now you understand when you die, for the first time in your life, what's going to happen is your consciousness is going to be untethered from your receiver. But you are still going to be you, okay? It's your consciousness that's going to live on even when your body is laid to rest here. You are your consciousness. Now, the Bible uses a different word to talk about what I've just talked about. What's the word? What's the biblical word for our consciousness that the Bible would use? The Bible just calls this our soul. And it's spiritual. And this is where the battle is primarily being fought, okay? Not in your kitchen with your cupboards. Not in your bedroom or doors shutting, all right? Not in your home. It's being fought in your consciousness. What we might also call your mind. Not your brain, your mind, okay? And so I know in the West we have a hard time with this, and it can be hard for us to think through, some of these things and think about some of these spiritual things. But guys, I just want to just raise the question: could some of the depression that some of you are experiencing, the anxiety, and some of the fear that some of you are battling, could some of that be spiritual attack in your consciousness? Could that be actually what's going on? I'm not saying there's not other, sometimes, reasons for it. Trauma, PTSD, these are real things. Guys, I'm not the guy who finds a demon behind every rock, but I want you to understand, we got a guy who's probably a God-fearing man sitting in a synagogue who's being tormented by a demon, and I can't help but wonder how many of us that could be today. Now, here is where we have really good news. Verse 25. But Jesus reprimanded this demon. Be quiet. Okay? Come out of the man, he ordered. At that, the evil spirit screamed, threw the man into a convulsion, and then came out of him. Amazement gripped the audience, and they began to discuss what had happened. What sort of new teaching is this? They asked excitedly. It has such authority. Even evil spirits obey his orders. The news about Jesus spread quickly throughout the entire region of Galilee. All right, so Jesus, man, we don't see a struggle here. We don't see a fight here. We just see Jesus say, be silent, okay, demon, because demons are liars. So I don't want you saying anything, because I don't know what you might say next. Quiet, and come out of this man and leave. And Jesus has the authority to command this spirit out, and it obeys. Guys, if we're going to understand the book of Mark as we study through this, we've got to understand that this is the primary purpose of Jesus' ministry. I just wonder what answer you would give me if I said, what was Jesus' primary purpose of ministry according to the Gospel of Mark? I wonder what we would say. Well, Mark is going to tell us explicitly what that is in chapter 1, verse 38. Jesus replied, he's talking to his disciples here, let us go somewhere else to the nearby village so I can preach there also. That is why I have come. So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and what? Driving out demons. Casting out the darkness. Pushing it back. Why did Jesus come? To preach the gospel so that the demons would flee and leave people's consciousness and train people how to guard their own consciousness through the gospel. You know, there's a lot of things Mark could have told us Jesus came to do. It could have said he was going throughout Galilee, preaching the gospel and helping the poor. And guys, don't get me wrong, that's Christian. Jesus did do that. Jesus helped the poor, but Jesus also balanced it and said, you know what? You're always going to have the poor. So you're going to need wisdom in how to go about that. It could have said Jesus went preaching in the synagogue and then doing these awesome teachings. He was a great teacher. He was an awesome teacher, but I need us to understand, church, because we often neglect to see this. Those of us in the West who don't like to think about spiritual things and demons and all that, it's primarily why he came. To preach the gospel so that these demons could be expelled. Mark makes it clear. Major theme of the Gospel of Mark. He has the authority to do this, and he's given the church the authority to do this. And guys, do we understand that this is what the church has done for the last 2,000 years? It's cast out these evil spirits where it's gone and where the churches have been planted. It's pushed back the darkness. In fact, let me tell you a cool story. Under the emperor known as Diocletian, he was, this is an early church period. He sparked what was called the Great Persecution. It was the worst persecution that Christians faced in the early church, feeding them to lions, burning them at stakes. His number one intent was to stamp out Christianity and put an end to it. Okay. Why? Why was Diocletian so opposed to Christianity? Well, in that day, they had these people, okay, and they were primarily women that were known as oracles. And the oracles would call upon what were known as the Python spirits to get future information about the future, that they would then give to the emperor so that he could make battle plans and have an edge over his enemies and decision-making and things like that. But what started to happen as Christianity began to spread, it became harder and harder for these oracles to hear from the Python spirits. And by the way, if that sounds weird to you, Python spirits, you should know that's in the Bible. In Acts 16, we read about a slave girl who can tell the future. Doesn't translate this for us in the English, but in the Greek, it's clear. She had a Python spirit. Apparently, these Python spirits give us information about the future, but as Christianity began to spread, the oracles couldn't receive the revelation they were asking for. And so they told Diocletian, you have to kill the Christians, which is what led to the great persecution. A little time later, another emperor came on the scene named Julius, and Julius wanted to reinstate the oracles and get them operating again. So he sent a delegation to the main oracle of Rome, known as the Oracle of Delphi. And the delegation showed up and listened to what the oracle tells this delegation to then tell the emperor. It says, tell the emperor that my hall has fallen to the ground. The god Apollo no longer has his house, nor his divination bay, nor his prophetic spring. The water has dried up. What happened, guys? What happened here? Christianity spread, and these demons, the god Apollo, they got cast out. And the oracles couldn't hear any longer from these spirits. And guys, I'm telling you, this is how Christianity spread. And this is what Christianity does. It cast out the spirits. It cast out the old gods. I mean, I sit there and wonder about things like this at times. Maybe you don't think about things, but I like, how in the world did the Vikings become Christianized? A group of people who used to go sack monasteries and take their gold and kill the Christians. How did they become Christianized? Well, what happened is these missionaries went in, right? And it wasn't just through preaching the gospel. Generally, these Vikings or whatever nation, the Druids of modern day UK or the Germanic people, they'd want to put the Christians to death, but then something inevitably would happen. Dr. Craig Keener talks about this in his book, Miracles, still happening today. Someone would get sick. And they would call on Odin or one of their gods to heal this person that was sick, and that person would not get better. And so in desperation, they would go to the missionary, and the missionary would pray, and God would show up, and he would heal. And those people would see that Yahweh was the one true God. In other words, guys, there was this power play happening. And the people there would see Yahweh was the Most High God, who had the power to heal. And so these people would then cast out their old gods and turn to Yahweh. And as they did that, they'd start experiencing things like joy, and they would start experiencing things like peace. And next thing you know, they're celebrating things like Christmas. Vikings start celebrating Christmas. This is what happened across the world. Where Christianity spread, the old gods got kicked out. So what's the problem? If the old gods, if the old spirits, these unclean spirits have been cast out, what's the issue? Well, Jesus is going to warn us about this and tell us why this is still a problem today. We read about this in Matthew 12. Jesus says, when an impure spirit or an evil spirit comes out of a person, it goes through arid places seeking rest and does not find it. So in other words, these spirits do not like to be cast into arid places. Okay, they can't find rest there. So then it says, I will return to the house, the person I left. And when it arrives, it finds the house unoccupied, swept clean, and put in order. And then it goes and it takes with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. And the final condition of that person is worse than the first. And it was at first, right? Now, you might think Jesus is talking about demons being cast out of people here, and that is true. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is using a person or a house as an analogy for what? He says at the end of this story, that is how it will be with this wicked generation. Jesus is actually talking about a generation. Jesus is actually talking about a nation. Jesus is actually talking about the nation of Israel here, and this applies to other nations as well. And what he's saying is, I'm going to come in, the gospel's going to go out, these old spirits are going to be cast out into the arid places, they're going to leave you, but then you're going to turn your back on me. and you're going to leave the house unoccupied. And that demon's going to go grab 7 other demons, and it's going to come back and fill that void, and you're going to be worse off than you were at first. Guys, do I need to tell you that's what's happening right now? This is the time we're living in. The West, we as a nation, we've turned our back on God. Just in the last 3 years, church attenders went from being in the majority to now being in the minority. That happened in the last 3 years, if you didn't know. We're turning our back on God, and these demons are now coming in to fill the unoccupied house. Do I need to give you examples of how we see that happening in culture right now? If you didn't know, last year was the highest suicide rate ever in U.S. history. Messing with people's consciousnesses, coming in, messing with people. Listen, I love people. I don't want to be misunderstood here, okay? But I'm just making this as an observation. Did we ever think we would see a day where young children are growing up and being told they can pick their gender and being confused about things like that? These are the times we're living in, guys. We're living in some wild times, like school shootings, things like this. Guys, I'm just trying to help us to understand what's happening. They were expelled, we turned our back, and now they have come in, and they've come in full force. I remember the day where the demons used to kind of sneak around. They're not sneaking around anymore, they're strutting, which means we have to be on guard. Yes? Your family has to be on guard. Mom, Dad, you've got to be on guard for the sake of your home. Sure, you're not leaving your house unoccupied. So guys, what do we do? I could have done a whole message on just what do we do. I've talked about this so many times over the years, but I want to leave us with one thing, where it starts, what we do about this. And this is a process. It's not a one and done thing. I was defeated by these demonic spirits in my consciousness. I was defeated for at least the first 10 years of my Christian life. I know what it's like to walk around in defeat, guilty, ashamed, feeling like God doesn't love you, feeling like I might get into heaven, but not sure about that, like just defeated, beat up by all the lies they like to come in and tell. I'm telling you, this is where it has to start. If you're going to start getting victory, if you're going to start pushing them back in your life and in your home, it has to start with worship. With saying, God, Yahweh, you are the Most High God. You are the God that I will serve. You are the God that is me and my household. We are going to follow. Yahweh, it's you. It's not Baal, this god of greed. It's not Asherah, this god of sex and pornography. God, I am going to make you my God, and I am going to give you the worship that you are due. I'm telling you, church, if you're going to push back the darkness in your own consciousness and you're going to fight for your children, this is where it has to start. It starts with who you worship, and worship becomes your weapon. And as we do that, and we grow in that, and when we learn about this one we're worshiping, what begins to happen is you start to be filled with more confidence, and you start to be filled with more courage, and you start getting the upper hand over these evil spirits, and you start learning how to cast them away when they try to come in. A few weeks ago, we got home late. I was with my kids, and I think this was actually New Year's Day, so it might have been after midnight because we were somewhere, and we came home, and my daughter went upstairs, and then she said, Dad, come upstairs quick. I think someone or something is in my room. I think it's in the closet, all right? She said, because I had the door shut, and now the door is open. So I went up there. Mikkola had turned on every light in the house, hall light. She now thought it was in her closet. She had her bedroom light on. She had every other light on. And guys, I went in, and the first thing I started doing is I turned off all the lights. And she said, Dad, what are you doing? And then I got close to the closet, and I looked at her with my Grinch face. It's pretty good, right? This is my Grinch face. And I said, Kayla, I'm about to open up this closet with my Grinch face, and I promise you, whatever's in there is going to be far more scared of me than I am it. Turned off all the lights, got my Grinch face ready, right? And of course, we didn't see anything in there. I knew, we have an alarm system, I knew no one was in there. But I wonder what's in your closet of your consciousness. And I wonder if you have the courage to face it and to know it has no hold on you, to know the authority you have in Christ, so you can push these spirits away. Guys, I'm telling you, the more we worship, the more confident and courageous, and the more free we become, the more our closets get cleaned out and Jesus fills that space. In fact, let me just give you this challenge. I didn't do this first service. If you start experiencing tension or any kind of fear in your home or anything like that, maybe even your family starts like getting into it, just go do something. Do a little experiment. Go turn on Christian music. Go turn on Christian worship. I don't know, maybe some elevation worship. I don't know, maybe some Beth. If you're an old schooler, go do some Michael W. Smith. I don't know what that might be for you, but turn it on. Just see if it doesn't change the atmosphere, because I'm telling you guys, worship is a weapon. And why do we worship this God? Maybe you're coming in here today and you've been beat up by the demons. Man, they're telling you you're a failure. You're still struggling with that thing they keep putting in front of you. Here's the good news. We got to get, church. We already have a sacrifice. His name is Jesus. Man, we just go to the cross. And we get to do that over and over and over. And once you learn that you have grace in your life and that that's why God gave you Jesus, to help sinners like us, then you get to look at the demons and say, there's nothing you can ultimately do to me. That's the power of the gospel. And when you rest in that and you learn to walk in that and you claim Christ, here's what happens. Worship. So let's claim the gospel this morning. Yes, church? Let's receive that sacrifice. Let's let the blood wash us from whatever we need to be cleansed of. And then let's get after it, worshiping this great Yahweh. Yahweh, we love you. We love you. And I know there's some of us coming in here today and we've been beat up. Our families are getting beat up. Teach us how to be worshipers, Lord. Teach us how much you love us. Teach us the grace you show us. Teach us that we already have the victory. We just have to learn to claim it and believe it. And God, as we do that, we might not be there yet, and we might not be walking perfectly in that victory, but God, we're going to claim this morning that you are our God. You are the God of our family. We want to grow in these things, and we're going to acknowledge you. We're going to acknowledge you in front of the false gods. We're going to acknowledge you in front of the evil spirits. We want them to know through our worship this morning, God, you are the one we serve. You are the one we love. So receive the glory this morning. And we say thank you and we love you. We pray this, Jesus, in your name. Amen.